The United States military began major combat operations in Iran.
Style strikes from Iran.
The U.S. deploying thousands more U.S. Marines to the Middle East.
Sent a massive deployment, 2,500 Marines to the Middle East.
To act to protect America.
As the conflict enters its fourth week, attacks have continued around the region, including in Iran and Israel.
It rained this morning in Tehran, and the rain seemed to be saturated with oil as well. You can see there's this black soot that's inside the rainwater.
We're going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated. Down your weapons and have complete immunity. Or, in the alternative, face certain death.
Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, is dead.
Terrorist machine, the mothership of terrorism, is sinking. That mothership of terrorism has a hole in it, and it's going to the bottom, and the captain is dead.
The US and Israel have entered a regime change war in Iran. This projects to be the biggest US intervention in the Middle East since the war on terror, and its consequences are massive.
A $200 billion war supplemental request.
So I think that you can't be fiscally conservative and be for unlimited warfare.
But if you're going to go to war, this is the last war that you want to start. Iran can do enormous damage to the international economy.
While the missile threat may cause the most alarm, it is the war's economic cost that is more significant. That comes primarily from the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Strait of Hormuz, a key shipping channel where a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas, or LNG, usually passes through, and a third of global fertilizer supplies.
Gas prices in the U.S. could reach a staggering $7 a gallon.
And farmers are making such low returns on the product that we're producing that we cannot absorb these costs.
President Trump says the US will, quote, obliterate Iran's power plants if it doesn't open the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours.
We're going to be in very good shape. You see what's happening. They are pretty much at the end of the line.
So America's in a very strong position. They think that they're going to harm the U.S. economy and get President Trump to back down. There couldn't be anything that was a stupider thing to say.
But today's development suggests that Iran has no intention of letting Donald Trump declare a quick victory.
And Iranians have been preparing 20 years for this conflict.
Any room for diplomacy anymore, because Donald Trump has been deceiving others.
Is now taunting President Trump for asking American allies for help. This is the U.S. flag tanker. This is the first time a U.S. flag tanker has been struck. This is a U.S. fighter jet after being hit allegedly by friendly fire.
And so what we're seeing is really the puncturing of the aura of invincibility and inability to sustain American hegemony for the past 20 years.
They see this is for Israel, not for America.
Israel has just plunged the world into probably the Third World War.
We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that that would precipitate an attack against American forces. And we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties.
I'm delighted that he has spelled it out, that this is the reason, that at the end of the day, the Israelis have been driving the vote on this one, and that the United States has followed their lead, and that this is what they decided. This is not, by any definition, America first.
This is not what we campaigned for. We said on every single rally stage, no more foreign wars, no more regime change. It's time to put America first, and this is a complete betrayal of those campaign promises.
How did we get here? Iran's nuclear program has been consistently pointed to as the key way Iran poses an existential threat to the US. So in this video, I'm going to cover the development of the Iranian nuclear program and whether or not Iran was developing a nuclear weapon, so you could determine for yourself whether Iran posed a threat to the US and whether this war is justified.
The diplomacy is the best way to prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon, and
we are not after getting a nuclear weapon, not because we are afraid of them. This is because of our belief that it is used for mass killing, and we oppose that. It is contradictory to our religion. We are
a comprehensive long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
That Iran is brazenly lying when it says it never had a nuclear weapons program.
That Iran is not building a nuclear weapon.
They had an active nuclear warhead program called Ahmad.
When Donald Trump withdrew US support and reimposed sanctions on Tehran.
At the heart of the Iran deal was a giant fiction that a murderous regime desired only a peaceful nuclear energy program.
Iran is signed on to what is known as the NPT. The NPT, officially titled the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, was signed into international law in 1968. The treaty is, quote, the cornerstone of the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. The NPT is essentially an agreement that countries without nuclear weapons won't develop them, and countries who already possess nuclear weapons will take steps to disarm.
The treaty's purposes are very simple: to commit the nations of the world which do not now have nuclear weapons not to produce or receive them in the future, to assure equally that such nations have the full peaceful benefits of the atom, and to commit the nuclear powers to move forward toward effective measures of arms control and disarmament.
Of course, nuclear technology is not limited to nuclear weapons. Many countries use nuclear facilities for nuclear energy. So the problem then arises of how to make sure a country's nuclear facilities are not secretly being used for building nuclear weapons. To address this, the NPT tasks the International Atomic Energy Agency with making sure that countries are adhering to safeguards. You can essentially think of safeguards as guardrails that make sure a country isn't using its civilian nuclear energy program to secretly develop nuclear weapons. They include inspections, monitoring equipment, environmental sampling, and satellite imagery. In the early 2000s, Iran was found to have a secret nuclear weapons program called Project Ahmad. The program was likely for the purpose of protecting against Iraq, which was its main rival at the time. The two countries had been fighting a brutal war for most of the 1980s. According to US intel in 2003, Project Ahmad was cancelled after the US toppled Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. However, while Project Ahmad was ended in 2003, Iran still continued to be out of compliance with the NPT. It may seem contradictory that Iran was out of compliance with the NPT even though it didn't have a nuclear weapons program anymore. So let me clarify. The safeguards are designed to make sure a country doesn't get anywhere close to developing a nuclear weapon. A country can be out of compliance with the safeguards while still not working on a nuclear weapons program. In the case of Iran, it seems that it would often fail to notify the IAEA on some aspects of its civilian nuclear program, and then upon the IAEA pressing the issue, Iran would be more transparent and things would check. The need to press for further transparency in the first place contributed to growing suspicion towards Iran, and while US intel found that Project Ahmad was decommissioned in 2003, the same report found that Iran was leaving the option open to restart the program in the future. So many felt that there was still a real threat that Iran would develop a nuclear weapon sometime in the future.
The Iranian government is defying the world with its nuclear ambitions, and the nations of the world must not permit the Iranian regime to gain nuclear weapons.
The concern was that without tighter restrictions and more transparency measures, if it decided, Iran would be able to build a nuclear weapon before anyone could stop it from doing so. The Iran nuclear deal, officially titled the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, aka the JCPOA, was agreed to in 2015.
Today, after 2 years of negotiations, the United States, together with our international partners, has achieved something that decades of animosity has not: a comprehensive long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
It is an international treaty that originally included the US, Iran, China, France, Germany, Russia, the UK, and the European Union. At its most basic level, the deal removed the sanctions on the Iranian economy in exchange for more transparency measures and tighter restrictions on its nuclear program. The JCPOA was widely viewed as Obama's signature foreign policy achievement. The Republicans fiercely opposed the JCPOA.
Not a single Republican was persuaded by the President and the Secretary of State when they have told us that this is the only option, that it is this deal, this catastrophic deal or war, and that this is the very best deal we could have gotten. If that is so, we shouldn't have been negotiating in the first place. This terrible deal will not stop a virulently anti-American and anti-Israeli regime from getting a nuclear bomb.
They argued that it didn't actually stop Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, but instead kicked the can down the road. Many of the new restrictions on Iran's nuclear program were set to expire in either 10 or 15 years. Critics have called these provisions sunset provisions. Republicans saw these sunset provisions as a fatal flaw. They argued that the combination of lifting the sanctions off Iran's economy along with the sunset provisions would allow Iran to modernize its economy in the meantime and sprint towards a nuclear weapon once the sunset provisions expired. They were especially concerned that Iran would continue to develop its long-range ballistic missile program, which could be potentially used to deliver a nuclear bomb once the sunset provisions expire.
They'll also continue to build long-range missiles. Missiles capable of reaching the United States. Those are not affected by this deal, and they'll continue to build them as they've been doing. And then at some point in the near future, when the time is right, they will build a nuclear weapon. And they will do so because at that point they will know that they have become immune, that we will no longer be able to strike their nuclear program because the price of doing so will be too high.
Enter then candidate Trump in 2015. Trump said that Iran deal was the worst deal ever made and promised to get out of the deal.
This is one of the worst deals ever made by any country in history.
Whether this was a purely politically and personally motivated desire to undo a major piece of Obama's legacy, or a reflection of a genuine opposition to the merits of the deal is open to interpretation. Trump's Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said that, quote, the JCPOA fails to achieve the objective of a non-nuclear Iran. It only delays our goal of becoming a nuclear state. There were also many critics of the JCPOA that argued that Iran was not complying with the deal. However, in July 2017, Tillerson certified that Iran was in compliance with the JCPOA. Tillerson's successor, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, along with an IAEA Director General Mano and a High Representative from the EU, all agreed that Iran was in compliance with the JCPOA. So it seems that Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA had to do with some combination of political and personal motivations, along with a genuine disagreement with the provisions of the deal, as opposed to the idea that Iran wasn't holding up their end of the bargain.
The agreement was so poorly negotiated that even if Iran fully complies, the regime can still be on the verge of a nuclear breakout in just a short period of time. The deal's sunset provisions are totally unacceptable.
In May 2018, Trump pulled out of the JCPOA and waged what he called a maximum pressure campaign by placing sanctions on Iran meant to cripple their economy. There are two rationales for this decision. One, by crippling Iran's economy, it makes it much harder for them to develop a nuclear weapon. And two, it can force Iran into accepting a much stricter deal. So Trump offered a new deal to Iran that was much stricter and involved concessions extending far beyond Iran's nuclear program, to include requiring Iran to change key components of its foreign policy, like its support for militant groups and changing its foreign policy towards other countries in the region, like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Yemen, and Israel. The deal was dead on arrival, and many didn't view the proposal as a serious offer, as the Iranian regime was never going to agree to such terms. Initially, after the U.S. withdrawal, Iran continued to comply with the JCPOA, but with the biggest benefit of the deal for them being gone and released from U.S. sanctions, eventually they stopped complying with the agreement. This Congressional Research Service report states, quote, beginning in July 2019, the IAEA verified that some of Iran's nuclear activities were exceeding JCPOA mandate limits. Iran has since increased the number of activities that violate JCPOA restrictions. According to IAEA reports, Iran's number of installed centrifuges, enriched uranium stockpile, enriched uranium U-235 concentration, and number of enrichment locations exceed JCPOA mandate limits. Tehran is also conducting JCPOA prohibited research and development activities, as well as centrifuge installation. The report also states that, quote, in a May 8, 2019 speech, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani cited JCPOA paragraph 26 as ground for reducing Iran's performance of some Iranian commitments pursuant to the agreement. According to that paragraph, quote, Iran has stated that it will treat such a reintroduction or reimposition of the sanctions specified in Annex 2 or such an imposition of new nuclear-related sanctions as grounds to cease performing its commitments under this JCPOA in whole or in part. So for this period, you essentially had the IAEA saying for Iran, you still need to comply with the JCPOA, even if the US is no longer a part of the deal. And Iran responded by saying that it doesn't need to comply with the deal since the US pulled out. Then came Biden in 2020, who promised to get back into the JCPOA or a new agreement with Iran.
Diplomacy is the best way to prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapon, and we discussed how best to encourage Iran to resume serious good faith negotiations. I think we're continuing to suffer from the very bad judgments that President Trump made in pulling out of the JCPOA. So that's one issue, and that issue is going to depend on whether and how that gets resolved is going to depend on their action and the willingness of our friends who were part of the original agreement to stick with us and make sure there's a price to pay economically for them to fail to come back.
The Biden administration initiated indirect talks with Iran, but ultimately failed to get a deal. It's unclear why, but two potential reasons are nationwide unrest in Iran and Iran's support for Russia in its war against Ukraine. When Trump re-entered the White House in early 2025, he initiated a new round of negotiations called the Oman Round.
Iran and the United States are holding a third round of nuclear talks this weekend.
While it's called the Oman Round, there were actually 5 rounds of talks spanning from April 12th to May 23rd, with the 6th round of talks being scheduled for June 15th. On June 13th, Israel began striking Iran. Many believe that Israel decided to strike Iran at this time to disrupt the negotiations between the US and Iran because Israel wanted the US to enter into the war. This can certainly be true, but there is also another factor to consider. Just one day earlier, on June 12th, the IAEA issued a new resolution on Iran's nuclear program. The June 12th IAEA resolution states, quote, noting the Director General's conclusion containing Gov 2025-25 that Iran did not declare nuclear material and nuclear-related activities at 3 undeclared locations in Iran, specifically Leviathan, Shian, Variman, and Turkazabad, and that because of the lack of technically credible answers by Iran, the agency is not in a position to determine whether the nuclear material at these undeclared locations in Iran has been consumed, mixed with other declared material, or still outside of safeguards, and that, quote, these undeclared locations were part of an undeclared structured program carried out by Iran until the early 2000s, and that some of these activities use undeclared nuclear material. This part is not new, as it has been known for a long time Iran had a nuclear weapons program up until 2003. However, this next part offers some new information that casts some doubt on how effective the JCPOA was in restricting Iran's nuclear program. Quote, noting with concern the agency's conclusion that Iran had retained unknown nuclear material and or heavily contaminated equipment and other assets arising from the former undeclared structured nuclear program at Turkazabad in the period 2009 until 2018, after which items were removed from the location, the whereabouts of which remain unknown. It's important to note here that the IAEA isn't saying that Iran had a secret nuclear weapons program, but instead that they failed to disclose all the locations of their civilian nuclear program. But still, this resolution reflects the growing concern on whether Iran's civilian nuclear program is solely meant for peaceful purposes. So we have the IAEA resolution and the Israel striking Iran 2 days before the next round of talks. So it's open for interpretation on whether Israel struck at that time due to genuine concern from the IAEA resolution, or whether they gave Israel the cover to carry out the strikes they wanted to in the first place. Whether Iran was working on building a nuclear weapon or not before the US strikes is a hotly debated question. Lex Friedman had 2 experts on his podcast to debate the issue. Scott Horan is the director of the Libertarian Institute and is a widely respected anti-war advocate. Mark Dubowitz is the CEO of the Foundation for Defending Democracy and hosts a podcast, The Iran Breakdown. Let's listen to their arguments, look at the evidence, and you can decide for yourself whether or not you think Iran was working on building a nuclear weapon prior to the US strike. First, let's hear Mark's argument on why he thinks Iran was building a nuclear weapon.
Let's examine the nuclear program and ask, does this sound like a regime that's not interested in building nuclear weapons? They built deeply buried underground enrichment facilities that they hid from the international community and they didn't disclose. They had an active nuclear warhead program called Ahmad, which ended in 2003 formally when the United States invaded Iraq. And we know that because not only has that been detailed by the IAEA, but actually Mossad, in a daring operation in Tehran, took out a nuclear archive and brought it back to the West. And then the IAEA, the United States, and the intelligence communities went after this detailed archive, went into it, and discovered that this supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, had an active program to build 5 atomic warheads. And was a very detailed program with blueprints and designs, all of which was designed under Ahmad to build a nuclear weapons program. So again, it's interesting to say that he doesn't have the intention to build nuclear weapons when he actually had an active nuclear weapons program.
Now let's hear Scott's argument on why he thinks Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon.
Under the JCPOA, they shipped out every bit of their enriched uranium stockpile. The French turned it into fuel rods and then shipped it back. That's the deal they're trying to get the U.S. back into, and we're obviously clearly willing to do. And again, the only reason they were enriching up to 60% was to put the pressure on the Americans to go ahead and get back into the deal.
A big part of where one comes down to this question is what sources one chooses to trust. Mark and Scott get into a pretty heated exchange on this topic. Let's take a listen and then we can start weighing the evidence.
The recent intelligence that has come out that the Iranian nuclear weapons scientists have begun preliminary work on building a warhead.
Came out from where? This intelligence that came out. Who put that into Israeli claims? Not verified by the U.S. and the Wall Street Journal anywhere, right?
Let's talk
about all of my list of refutations of all your false claims from 10 years ago.
The Wall Street Journal did verify this.
A lot of Lawrence Norman to refute.
One at a time. Lawrence Norman actually wrote a piece. This was during the Biden administration because the Biden DNI had actually come out and for the first time in their annual threat assessment had removed a line that said Iran is not currently working on developing any capabilities that would put it in a position to actually deliver a nuclear warhead. And what became the Lawrence Norman piece in the Wall Street Journal was that there actually was initial work done on metallurgy and on computer modeling. And so those actually were defined terms in Section T of the 2015 JCPOA, which defined weaponization in that section. And metallurgy and computer modeling were some of the initial steps. So the DNI was very concerned under Biden that these initial steps meant that either Khamenei had given the green light or nuclear weapons scientists, in order to get ahead of the boss so they could be in a position if he decided to move forward on this, were in a position and their timelines were therefore expedited. So it's interesting. I mean, again, you've got the DNI under Biden, you've got the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, you've got Israeli intelligence, you've got the Wall Street Journal, and you've got the IAEA asking questions of Iran on its past weaponization activities. Why are you denying us?
Who's the dog that didn't bark there? The current director of National Intelligence, who issued her threat assessment, Trump's director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who issued her threat assessment in February that repeated the exact same language that from the National Intelligence estimate of 2007, and that the CIA and the NIE, the National Intelligence Council, have reaffirmed repeatedly ever since then, which is that Supreme Leader has not decided to pursue nuclear weapons. He has not made the political decision to pursue nuclear weapons. She testified under oath in front of the Senate in March, and then according to CNN and the New York Times, there was a brand new assessment that was put together the week before the attack was launched, reaffirming the same thing. And at least in history, if you read it in Haaretz, Mossad agreed with the CIA.
Let's weigh the evidence. The various types of evidence that we have are U.S. intelligence, IAEA reports, and Israeli intelligence. Let's look at the U.S. intelligence from last year or so and go in chronological order. First, we have the 2024 Annual Threat Assessment from the U.S. intelligence community, published by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence on February 5, 2024. The assessment states, quote, Iran is not currently undertaking the key nuclear weapons development activities necessary to produce a testable nuclear device. In 2020, however, Tehran has stated it is no longer constrained by any JCPOA limits, and Iran has greatly expanded its nuclear program, reduced IAEA monitoring, and undertaken activities that better position it to produce a nuclear device, if it chooses to do so. Then we have this July 2024 report from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The quick background on this report is that it is done regularly as part of the Iran's Nuclear Weapons Capability and Monitoring Act of 2022. This is the report that Mark refers to that doesn't contain the usual line that says that Iran isn't building a nuclear weapon. All the past reports mandated by the act always included a line saying Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon. This time it was replaced with a line that reads, quote, there has been a notable increase this year in Iranian public statements about nuclear weapons, suggesting this topic is becoming less taboo. When I first read this report, I was surprised to hear that there was any taboo at all around the idea of building a nuclear weapon in Iran. Then I stumbled upon something later that made this make sense, that shocked me that I hadn't learned it earlier. I'll get into that shortly, but for now, let's move on to the third report. The third report is just a previous report done just a few months later in November 2024. In this report, the usual line about Iran not building a nuclear weapon is back. Quote, the intelligence community continues to assess that as of 26 September 2024, Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. Tehran has, however, undertaken activities that better position it to produce one if it so chooses. The last piece of U.S. intel we have is the Annual Threat Assessment for 2025 that states, quote, we continue to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon and that Khamenei has not reauthorized the nuclear weapons program he suspended in 2003, though pressure has probably built on him to do so. So to review the U.S. intel, we have a source from February 2024 saying Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, a source from July 2024 not saying Iran isn't, but also not saying it is building a nuclear weapon. This report is essentially neutral on the matter. A source from November 2024 saying Iran isn't building a nuclear weapon, and a source from March 2025, just a few months before the U.S. strike, saying Iran isn't developing a nuclear weapon. Echoing the findings from the March 2025 Annual Threat Assessment Report, we have the current Director of National Intelligence testifying under oath to Congress that the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community is that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003.
Now, if you were following the news close at the time, you probably know the story gets a bit more complicated in regard to DNI Director Tulsi Gabbard. More on that in a second. For now, let's move on to the evidence we have from the IAEA. The IAEA has been monitoring Iran's nuclear program for a long time and issues regular reports. From what I could tell, the IAEA has never found that Iran was developing nuclear weapons.
The nuclear-related commitments undertaken by Iran are being implemented.
However, there have been times in which Iran hasn't been transparent about its civilian nuclear program or complied with safeguards. As we have touched on before, the IAEA recently issued a resolution on some undeclared facilities that raised some concern. Here is the Director General of the IAEA discussing a report related to the resolution just a few days before the U.S. strike.
In this report, we said very clearly and very objectively that Iran was not informing the IAEA about a number of things which are very, very important. And at the same time, we said very clearly in that report that preceded these dramatic events and the attack that we did not find in Iran elements to indicate that there is an active, systematic plan to build a nuclear weapon.
With this, I think it's fair to take the assessment from the IAEA as another piece of evidence that Iran is not developing a nuclear weapon. This brings us to the Israeli intelligence, and this is where things get interesting.
Last week, Israel published intelligence documents, long concealed by Iran, conclusively showing the Iranian regime and its history of pursuing nuclear weapons. The fact is, this was a horrible one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made.
Here is a clip of Israeli Prime Minister unveiling what he claims are Iran's secret nuclear files that Israeli intelligence gathered. This presentation was given in English for a U.S. audience just days before Trump pulled out the JCPOA.
So these files conclusively prove that Iran is brazenly lying when it says it never had a nuclear weapons program. The files prove that. But here's what happened next. Iran was faced with mounting pressure in 2003. You remember that. That was following the Gulf War. So it was forced to shelve Project Ahmad. But it didn't shelve its nuclear ambitions. So Iran devised a plan to do two things. First, to preserve the nuclear know-how from Project Ahmad. And second, to further develop its nuclear weapons-related capabilities. That plan came directly from Iran's top leadership. Here's another document from the archive. This is following the new directive of Iran's Minister of Defense, Mr. Shamkhani. Today is the director of the National Security Council. Following the new directive of Iran's Minister of Defense, the work would be split into two parts, covert and overt. A key part of the plan was to form new organizations to continue the work. This is how Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, head of Project Ahmad, put it. Remember that name, Fakhrizadeh. So here's his directive. It's right here. And he says, the general aim is to announce the closure of Project Ahmad, but then he adds, special activities, you know what that is, special activities will be carried out under the title of scientific know-how developments. This is exactly what Iran proceeded to do. It continued this work in a series of organizations over the years, and today in 2010, 2018, this work is carried out by Sapand. That's an organization inside Iran's defense ministry. And you will not be surprised to hear that Sapand is led by the same person who led Project Ahmad, Dr. Fakhrizadeh, and also, not coincidentally, many of Sapand's key personnel worked under Fakhrizadeh on Project Ahmad. So this atomic archive clearly shows that Iran planned at the highest levels to continue work related to nuclear weapons under different guises and using the same personnel.
Without digging into all the files that Netanyahu references here, we are essentially left with a choice of how we rank the evidence. If you view the US intel and assessment from the IAEA to be more credible, then it makes sense to conclude that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon. If you find Israeli intelligence to be more credible, then it makes sense to conclude that Iran was building a nuclear weapon. This takes us back to DNI Director Tulsi Gabbard. Remember the clip where she testified under oath to Congress that according to US intel, Iran is not developing a nuclear weapon. But once Trump made the decision to strike Iran, these comments didn't age well, as it put her into conflict with Trump, who is essentially her boss. She then pivoted and said that Iran could produce a nuclear weapon within a few weeks. Now if we just look at these two statements side by side, what do you think? Can both these statements be true? Can Iran not be building a nuclear weapon, but also be weeks away from having the capability to do so? Some would say yes, and some would say no. In this case, I think it's pretty clear that Tulsi chose to emphasize how close Iran was to being able to develop a nuclear weapon once she felt the heat from Trump. So Tulsi's pivot here is probably just about keeping her job. It's not that she is lying when she says Iran is only a few weeks away from a bomb, but instead that she chose to emphasize a different fact to justify the actions of her boss. Either way, this question of capability versus actively trying to build a nuclear weapon is one that goes far beyond Tulsi and actually gets to the core of the disagreement over whether Iran is building a nuclear weapon. Let's hear what the Director General of the IAEA has to say on the issue.
Of course, that Iran, even at the highest levels of the supreme leader, had indicated that a nuclear weapon would be incompatible with Islam. And you remember the fatwa and what Iran has been saying. I said that in the report, noting it, but at the same time, I said that it didn't help also when high officials in Iran were saying, actually, we do have all the pieces of the puzzle. We just need to put them together.
The Director General makes a clear distinction between capability and whether or not Iran is actually developing a nuclear weapon. However, like I said earlier, there are those that would argue both those things can't be true at the same time.
I'd like to just sort of quote CIA Director John Ratcliffe, because Scott brought up the CIA and the intelligence community. I think Ratcliffe had a good way of looking at this, and that he said is, you know, when you're in the 99-yard line as a football team, you have the intention to score a goal, quote unquote. Let's not talk about this debate about whether Khamenei had given the order or not given the order, because Khamenei knows that if he gives an order, the U.S. and Israeli intelligence community will pick up on that order, and that will be the trigger for strikes. What Ratcliffe is saying is that Khamenei had built the nuclear weapons capability. He's at the 99-yard line, and both the CIA and European leaders, the European intelligence community has said for years that if Iran has that capability and they're on the 99-yard line, at that point it's going to be too late to stop them.
So essentially the argument is that Iran being close to having the capability to build a nuclear weapon means that Iran is building a nuclear weapon. This assumption is on one hand very logical, because why would Iran do all this work to get close to having the capability to build a nuclear weapon if it didn't actually intend on building one? Well, there are two possible explanations for this. First, we have to remember back to the JCPOA. The JCPOA came about because there was concern with Iran's nuclear program. Iran agreed to ease these concerns by accepting more restrictions and transparency measures on its program in exchange for relief from sanctions that were hurting its economy. One way of looking at this is that Iran was able to leverage concerns about its nuclear program to get sanctions relief. When Trump pulled out the JCPOA and placed even more sanctions on Iran, you could see how Iran could calculate that it should really ramp up its nuclear program to raise even more concerns over the program so that it would have leverage for a deal to get the sanctions removed the same way it did with the JCPOA. In this way of looking at the situation, Iran essentially miscalculated. Instead of those concerns over its program being used as leverage, they became a justification for the US strike. This game of high-stakes chicken built off leverage and strategic calculation is common in geopolitics, and when massive miscalculations happen, war is often the result. The second potential explanation also falls into this game of chicken, but instead of using leverage for a deal to benefit its economy, it uses leverage for defense purposes. The second potential explanation is that Iran wanted to be very close to having the capability of developing a nuclear weapon so that the US and Israel would be afraid of attacking it, whether that was either limited strikes against leadership and its nuclear program or a full-blown regime change war. The logic here is that the US and Israel would not want to mess with a country that is so close to getting a nuclear weapon, because as Mark said in the clip, if it gets super close at that point, it would be too late to stop it from getting one, and no one wants to get into a military conflict with a country that could soon have a nuclear weapon. Both of these explanations can be true at the same time, and when we weigh them together, we could actually see that there is definitely a case for why Iran would want to get to the 99-yard line but not go any further. However, if you're someone who sees Iran as an existential threat to the security of Israel or the US, you could see how Iran being so close to having a nuclear weapon can be enough to justify taking military action to set the program back, regardless of what Iran's intentions are. Now, there's just one key piece of information left on this whole issue of whether Iran was building a nuclear weapon or not prior to the US strike. Remember before I said I was surprised to find out that discussing building a nuclear weapon is taboo in Iran? This is because the recently assassinated supreme leader had issued a religious declaration known as a fatwa, saying a nuclear weapon was incompatible with Islam. Joe Kent recently resigned from his position as the director of the United States National Counterterrorism Center over disagreement with the war. Here is what he had to say about the fatwa and other details on Iran's nuclear program.
Was Iran on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon?
No, they weren't, 3 weeks ago when this started, and they weren't in June either. I mean, the Iranians have had a religious ruling, a fatwa, against actually developing a nuclear weapon since 2004. That's been in place since 2004. That's available in the public sphere. But then also we had no intelligence to indicate that fatwa was being disobeyed or it was on the cusp of being lifted. The Iranian strategy, it's actually pretty pragmatic. The Iranians are obviously aware of what's taking place in their region, and their strategy was to not completely abandon their nuclear program, because they saw what happened to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya when he said, hey, I've got no more nukes. I'll do what you say. I'll give up my nukes.
And we gave him the Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah, we regime changed him, and he was, executed by his own people in the most horrific way.
Sodomized by a bayonet. Right.
The Iranians' position, when viewed from the lens of the region, was actually fairly pragmatic. They were preventing, themselves from developing a bomb, but they still wanted the ability. They wanted the ability to enrich. They wanted the ability to have some components so that they weren't completely stripped of it. And when we always assessed that they were either several months or a year, 2 years away from actually being able to develop a nuclear weapon.
With that, I think we have covered just about everything needed for you to make up your own mind on whether Iran was building a nuclear weapon prior to Operation Midnight Hammer. But while Iran's nuclear program has been central to justifying U.S. military action against Iran, it's not the only thing to consider. Even if you think Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon, you could still think a regime change war is justified based off Iran's support for militant groups and its brutal repression of its own people. On the other hand, even if you think Iran was building a nuclear weapon prior to Operation Midnight Hammer, that doesn't automatically mean the US should be conducting a regime change war in Iran. After all, indications of the program was set back by a significant amount. Here is what the widely respected physicist and nuclear expert David Albright said shortly after Operation Midnight Hammer.
And so is there an assessment on how far back the program is set?
Well, it can take them years to rebuild these facilities. I mean, I hate to put a year on it, but it's not going to happen anytime soon.
So if the issue was just Iran's nuclear program, then why is a regime change war necessary when the program was set back so far and the US could always just strike the facility again? It's possible Iran's nuclear program was never really the issue, but justification for something else. In Trump's announcement of the regime change war, he first highlighted the regime's support for militant groups and its repression of its own people.
Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime. For 47 years, the Iranian regime has chanted death to America. From Lebanon to Yemen and Syria to Iraq, the regime has armed, trained, and funded terrorist militias that have soaked the earth with blood and guts. Iran is the world's #1 state sponsor of terror and just recently killed tens of thousands of its own citizens on the street as they protested.
However, he also brought up Iran's nuclear program.
It has always been the policy of the United States, in particular my administration, that this terrorist regime can never have a nuclear weapon.
Here is DNI Director Tulsi Gabbard testifying again under oath to Congress just a week ago on Iran's nuclear program.
You noted in your opening statement you're here fulfilling a statutory responsibility and that your testimony, quote, represents the IC's assessment of threats,
That's right.
correct? That opening statement, as submitted to the committee in advance of this hearing, stated that as a result of last summer's airstrikes, quote, Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated, end quote, correct?
That's right.
And is that in fact the assessment of the intelligence community?
Yes.
So the assessment of the intelligence community is that Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated by last summer's airstrikes.
Yes.
In the opening statement you submitted to the committee last night also stated, quote, there has been no effort since then to try to rebuild their enrichment capability, end quote, correct?
That's right.
And that's the assessment of the intelligence community.
Yes.
The White House stated on March 1st of this year that this war was launched and was, quote, a military campaign to eliminate the imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime, end quote. That's a statement from the White House. Quote, the imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime. Was it the assessment of the intelligence community that there was an imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime?
The intelligence community assessed that Iran maintained the intention to rebuild and to continue to grow their nuclear enrichment capability.
Was it the assessment of the intelligence community that there was a, quote, imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime, yes or no?
Senator, the only person who can determine what is and is not an imminent threat is the president.
False. This is the
worldwide
worldwide threats hearing where you present to Congress national intelligence, timely, objective, and independent of political considerations. You've stated today that the intelligence community's assessment is that Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated and that, quote, there had been no efforts since then to try to rebuild their enrichment capability. Was it the intelligence community's assessment that nevertheless, despite this obliteration, there was a, quote, imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime? Yes or no?
It is not the intelligence community's responsibility to determine what is and is not an imminent threat.
No, it is precisely
that he receives.
It is precisely your responsibility to determine what constitutes a threat to the United States. This is the worldwide threats hearing where, as you noted in your opening testimony, quote, you represent the IC's assessment of threats. You are here to represent the IC's assessment of threats. And so my question is, as you're here to present the IC's assessment of threats, was it the assessment of the intelligence community that, as the White House claimed on March 1st, there was a, quote, imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime? Yes or no?
The intelligence community has provided the inputs that make up this annual threat assessment.
You won't answer the question.
It is the nature of the imminent threat that the president has to make that determination based on a collection and volume
You're here
of
to be
information and
timely,
intelligence that he is provided with.
You're here to be timely, objective, and independent of political considerations.
Exactly what I'm doing.
No, you're evading a question because to provide a candid response to the committee would contradict a statement from the White House.
Tulsi isn't the only one that has sent mixed messages. Here is the Vice President J.D. Vance just weeks before the 2024 election.
Israel has the right to defend itself, but America's interest is sometimes going to be distinct. Like sometimes we're going to have overlapping interests, and sometimes we're going to have distinct interests. And our interest, I think, very much is in not going to war with Iran, right? It would be a huge distraction of resources. It would be massively expensive to our country.
Only time will tell where things go from here. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon.